Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. When I was a kid, we always looked forward to my dad's work picnic. He was a tool and die maker for a leading caster manufacturer that would rent out a local park, make a ton of food, and put on various games and activities for the families. One of the highlights of this day was a softball game, pitting the office versus the shop. It was a friendly rivalry, but one that nonetheless existed and kind of stemmed from who played a greater role in the company's success. The reality, of course, is that both segments were equally crucial and called upon an organic sort of interdependency to keep things moving. The good-natured shots that were fired across the dugouts of this summer classic remind me of the challenges we see in industrial cybersecurity when it comes to bringing OT and IT teams together. While great strides have been made and numerous lessons learned on why these groups need to sync up, the reality is that we still have a long way to go. Over the last couple of months, we've had some interesting takes on how to realize this need, so let's revisit the following thoughts on the IT-OT working relationship from Kris Lovejoy, the Global Security and Resilience Leader at Kyndryl, John Cusimano, VP of OT Security at Armexa, Josh Williams, the Strategic Account Manager at IriusRisk, and Rod Locke, Director of Project Management at Fortinet.
What I find in manufacturing is, most manufacturers have a, sort of the IT and then the OT side of the organization, from an engineering and an operations perspective. You have the folks that manage the production lines, and then you have kind of the IT folks that are creating the systems, like the logistics systems, et cetera, that, are required. And, what happens is the production line folks, they have the safety first mentality. So everything is about safety and production line performance. Nothing can go down. And because nothing can go down, what happens is they don't want to upgrade systems. They don't want to secure those, not necessarily not secure them, but they don't want to configure them in any way that's going to hurt the performance of those systems. Meanwhile, the IT folks are more into, let's throw more technology at it. Let's upgrade. Let's do all this. So there's kind of this dichotomy between the two. And I do think, today with IIoT, IoT, 5G, a lot of these buzzwords that, some of the listeners might not necessarily understand, but suffice to say, they are the technologies that enable those production lines to be connected to the internet. Because that is happening, it's introducing more risk. And so the requirement to actually have conversations with the production line leaders who own these systems and are required for securing them, it's just a very, very different kind of conversation that you have on the other side.
Very true. We've talked a lot about those silos for IT and OT and manufacturing. And I think over the last probably 5 years, there's been a lot of work done in trying to break those down and get people working together. What are you seeing there in working? I can see you nodding your head that we're trying, but we're maybe not getting there as quickly as we should. What's been your experience in working with manufacturers and trying to get those two entities talking to each other?
I think there's some organizations that are leading, right? And they tend to be the kind of manufacturers of those goods and services that may not be, critical infrastructure. So oil, gas, food, chemicals, the things that we rely on every day to survive, those tend to lag a bit in comparison to those organizations that are able to drive. I think a lot of it, interestingly enough, is more about the financing of the equipment that is used to support the production than it is actually a cultural issue per se. And, what I've noticed is that a lot of the companies that are critical infrastructure industries, some of them are publicly supported, like energy generation companies that are tied to utilities, as an example. Some of them are just capital heavy or capital intensive industries. The way they fund their operations is through the deployment of capital. Right? What happens with capital is you buy equipment, you deploy that equipment, and then you depreciate that equipment over a long period of years. Organizations that are not critical infrastructure, they tend to have a bit more flexibility in funding. They can move to what we call, an OpEx model. And so what they're doing is they're paying to use technology as kind of an added drink perspective. they've already moved their SAP systems to the cloud. They're already kind of pushing forward. And so when it comes to technology that is fixed, you tend not to want to change that technology because of the funding model. Whereas if you're a cloud model, an OpEx model, you can afford to change the security in and around it. So I think there's a dynamic, which is there is culture, but there is also the financing, which kind of underpins how things operate as well.
Talking about working with IT, and we know we can't just cut and paste a lot of those approaches over to the OT environment. You being an automation engineer kind of from the start, how have you seen that relationship with the IT guys sort of evolve over time? I'm sure there was some headbutting that went on at some point. Hopefully we've minimized that a little bit now, but I think it still goes on in a lot of organizations. Or what are you seeing there in terms of those two entities sort of working together now?
Yeah, it certainly has changed a lot over the years. And we are definitely seeing, we talk about the convergence of IT and OT, and we see that not only in the technology, but also in personnel. Yeah. There's a convergence and a better understanding. OT and IT seem to have a better understanding of each other than they did years ago. It does vary quite a bit by company. You'll see, some that are very, very cooperative and proactive, and some that there's still tension for sure. And it's usually due to not understanding each other's environments and particularly the nuances of an operational environment and the things that are critical in the OT environment, such as safety risk, of course, and operational production demands, not being able to reboot a computer that's running a facility, for example. So there's those kind of operational differences. So even though the technology's oftentimes very similar, the operational requirements in OT are very different. So if IT and OT don't understand those differences, they sometimes struggle. That's a lot of time.
A lot of organizations, and I'm not bashing IT folks in any way, shape, or form, but it's a different type of question that they're used to asking as opposed to the OT side. So it just seems to make it so much more important that we get better at bringing OT and IT together. And I know there's been a lot of advances there, but I'd be curious to see from your perspective in working with industrial organizations, is that maybe one of the issues that we're having in making sure that secure by design is being realized?
I think so. And I'll say when I first started in at a manufacturing plant, OT, they had an OT, a few people on the OT team, and they were a part of IT, but nobody knew what they did. Nobody understood what was going on. They were over in a corner. And, in reality, if you didn't see them at like a company party, you forgot they even were around. Right? They lived in this whole world completely outside of us. And so what I think is exactly to your point, and I will say that that's changed. And what I think is my optimistic outlook to it is that I think we're seeing those lines converge a bit. I think it's being led by technology. I mean, naturally, we're seeing IT organizations, IT vendors, IT technology being put into OT. Now, that comes with a whole basket of, new things to deal with that could be, detrimental. But what that is doing is that's getting, the IT profession or that OT side of things in with the IT professionals who know how to answer some questions, but know some to ask. The OT has their own expertise they can put in, and that melding together, I think, is going to be one of the biggest leaps we have in ensuring good, proper cybersecurity across ICS, across manufacturing technology type organizations and teams.
Yeah, got to keep working together there. I just think that point you made about asking the right questions beforehand as opposed to trying to figure it out once you get it in place. Because once you get it in place, you're worried about, does it work? Does it function the way we want it to? Security almost becomes an afterthought, which is why we're having a lot of these problems now when it comes to OT security.
Both, actually. And I know that people in OT love to tell horror stories of how IT has installed things that blew up their environment. I think with these types of devices, in some cases, it's actually the operational networking team that that own those networks up, or maybe used to own those networks, and they weren't really part of the remit even of the CISO. one thing that we've seen with Fortinet, we do an annual survey of operational technology security professionals and practitioners specifically. And one thing that we've seen is a very strong trend towards OT security being part of the remit of the CISO. So they may not make every decision, and they might have a converged SOC even where all incidents are flowing up to the same SOC. The SOC may not have OT expertise. They may still phone back to the plant and say, hey, we saw this alert, can you tell us what's going on there? But I think in some cases, it might have actually been the operational networking team that installed that, that set up the network the way it is, right? So I think organizations, some organizations are moving beyond this kind of divide, even where they just view it as like, we're responsible for all these networks. We need to look at the requirements for these different types of networks, these different types of systems in terms of availability, so that you're not just saying like, well, thou shalt patch instantly and maybe knock something offline. It's equally bad to just blindly apply all the patches. But
yeah,
I think that's yeah. I don't want to lay the blame at the feet of IT every time.
No, fair enough, absolutely. And I think it's a convergence of these two sort of silos beginning to work together more and trying to figure out that process and what makes the most sense.
For sure. And it's a little bit, a lot of it is IT being able to understand what the needs of OT are, and often understanding that, IT has this, from the IT side, they often have this mentality of sort of shoot first, ask questions later, shut it down if you don't know what's going on. In the OT environment, you've got plant managers who are responsible for keeping production online. And, in a lot of like commercial companies, they're the ones making the money. So you're responsible to keep things operating, keep manufacturing moving, keep your processes moving. And as IT, I need to understand that mindset as well in terms of their an adjustment from what they do for somebody's laptop, where they detect some malware on the laptop, it's going offline right away.
Our guests have also weighed in on some of the more challenging dynamics of improving the IT-OT dynamic. These have included Brian Deken, the commercial manager of cybersecurity services at Rockwell Automation, Riley Groves, an engineer from Auvesy-MDT, and Theo Zafirakos, cyber risk and information security expert at Fortra. IT and OT, traditionally there's all this talk about breaking down silos, getting everybody to work together, all of that things. We know it's a priority. From your experience, how's the industrial sector doing? Are we getting better? Have strides been made there? Do we still have a long way to go? What's your take?
Yeah, Jeff, it's a great question. We probably could have, an hour-long conversation on just this topic alone. It's all over the board, much like everybody else on every journey. The one thing I do know is the customers who I work with and I have conversations with, who have the highest and deepest level of OT cyber maturity and are the most resilient and are considered the most secure, also have the most organized approach between their IT and OT teams. They have the highest level of communications. They're in touch with each other. They understand each other's position, and they are working together as often as possible. I've run into certain organizations that even have named their initiatives around their IT-OT convergence in organizations, TITO, Tito backwards, OTIT. So when they told me they had a Tito organization, I knew right away that they were working together. Other meetings, you get IT and OT in the room, you're happy to see that level of decision making in the same room. But IT sits here on the left-hand side and OT sits on the other side, and they shake hands like they've never met each other. and you get a little bit of a chuckle out of that. And it's all over the board. It's a must. And I think back to the point around NIST 2.0, governance can help bring some of that decision making together, because it's a must. The world is flat. The Ethernet, disappearing lines, necessarily not having a 3.5 layer with an IDMZ. You got to make those decisions and make those choices as a team.
Yeah, I think one of the big things that IT and OT and bringing them together, I think they need to start understanding the hackers know about this divide too. They know that there's this division and that there's not as much cohesiveness in the way a lot of these networks and endpoint security is put together. You know, you also mentioned sort of the relationship between IT and OT. And in the industrial sector, that has been tough, getting those folks talking to each other. What are you seeing now? Has it been improving? Are we there yet? What's your take in terms of those two entities coming together a little bit more?
While it is still in its infancy, we do see a lot of, especially from a cybersecurity perspective, IT folks getting involved in these OT group conversations early rather than later, and kind of picking up the pieces later to make sure that they do have a secure solution deployed in their environments. So when we talk about that melding of OT and IT, we're seeing a lot more devices that are networked. So within that shop floor deployment across the OT layer, there are so many more devices that are configured within that network, and kind of locking those down is very important. But if there is a breach and you do have some type of vulnerability within that shop floor deployment, because those devices are networked, even if they are locked down, we're still seeing some potential there for a breach that not only affects a singular device, but could stretch across a family of devices, or even the entirety of that OT layer. So we definitely have a very attentive group to understanding those impacts and wanting to ensure that there's no gaps in that process.
You know, you brought it up, and I can always tell what people's personal experiences have been when I ask this question just by their nonverbals. But one of the big challenges, and we talk about this a lot, is that dynamic between IT and OT personnel. And you alluded to trying to get them to work together. What's been your experience in terms of how those two factions are working together? How far have we come, or what are some of the bigger obstacles that you've seen there?
Well, awareness of each other's requirements and risks is the biggest challenge. What we've seen in the past is that you have to train the OT personnel on cybersecurity, which in my opinion may be easier on training cybersecurity personnel on OT risks, but it depends on the individuals. But you have to train them, and you have to understand. And for cybersecurity, it applies not just to OT, but for every business unit that you are tasked to support. You have to understand what their concerns, what the capabilities are, what their capacities are, and so on, in order to provide proper support. OT personnel, on the other side, are mostly trained to provide systems that remain operational and available. But availability is a task of cybersecurity, right? The cyber criminal hits your system, it's no longer operational, it's no longer available. Did you implement the proper controls to defend against a human attacker, right? Because cybercrime, cyber breaches happen because the adversary is a human, not just a system anymore, or a software that went down.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I can tell by your response. I think we're gaining some ground there. We're getting better, because I didn't see any eye rolling or wringing of hands or anything else. We've had some other guests definitely tell some horror stories in terms of trying to get those two to work together. So it looks like we're gaining some ground at least. That's going to wrap it up for this episode, but thanks so much for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.